Thank you. Good morning. Yes, my name is Samantha Solano. I'm from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. I graduated in 2016 from Harvard Graduate School of Design with a master's in landscape architecture. And I am talking to you from the perspective of a designer, someone who has not been trained formally in mapping, and I'm teaching myself GIS on the way and as I go. But my questions around the global arid landscape are because being in Las Vegas, thinking about how we have urbanized and how we design in these arid landscapes, and how we can start to think about the global futures throughout these contested, marginalized, maybe empty spaces that are on the map. So the arid, the desert, landscapes lacking water, in my opinion, have yet to be critically evaluated and respected by designers, planners, developers, officials, and even being understood throughout society. Its function as a landscape has most commonly been reduced to voids that can be appropriated to support any form without regard to its context, basically being treated as a blank slate. Within the arid, there is vast wilderness and expansive processes of urbanization. It is a landscape that exemplifies human ingenuity, right, our ability to survive and change the actual landscape. And it's also a landscape of extreme environmental pressures and extreme fragility. The threats of rapid urbanization and climate change reveal an overall global unreadiness, but with current global initiatives that are preparing for these uncertainties are focusing on defending coasts while fighting deserts, right, desertification. And this is where my frustrations have emerged. I started this interrogation through just scouring Google Earth of all these different diverse, beautiful, empty, arid landscapes as we classify them. And what I found is just these immense, beautiful patterns that I'm starting to collect in this catalog of arid landscapes, right? And so what I want to depict in this is just looking at its unique features and how we describe them as, oh, there's nothing there, but in reality we have this rich, diverse ecology that emerges and is resilient. Right, so there's these beautiful instances of these colors and looking at water and how it pools and how it moves. And then there's these patterns of how we have transformed this landscape. And this is in Kazakhstan. And just the diversity of the arid landscapes themselves and how we have appropriated them for our consumptive practices. This is my favorite image. This is actually what I believe is a palm orchard in the middle of the Libyan desert. And I use this on all my graphics, but it just shows this contrast between urban practices and this landscape that you have to irrigate this, and where does the water come from, and all these other layers of questions start to think about how this landscape was viewed and why it is appropriated this way, right? Here, this is in China. And then also, there's these patterns, these juxtaposing patterns between, here this is in Cairo, the historic center next to this new growth, right? This rapid urbanization that we're seeing in a lot of these global arid cities, and here's New Cairo. And how, as a landscape architect and as a landscape urbanist, how we decide to interface with these grounds is really critical as we move forward and think about how we design for climate uncertainty. And then also, the quintessential sprawl that I'm really familiar with in the desert Southwest, right, that has spread across the landscape. And again, these practices of thinking that the ground is void, is blank, and not responding to the local ecology, the local systems that are inherent in the landscape. And then there's this, right? These anomalies in the landscape where what was happening, and then these clear bounds and these edges, which I think is also really important. Like, what is the edge when there's nothing on, the other side, and how do we start to delineate these patterns? As I was searching for relevant design discourse for my students, right? I teach in landscape architecture, and starting to talk about how we can start to interface at an infrastructural scale, a landscape scale, through desert landscapes, I was left with very little examples, and this is kind of where this research really started to emerge. And there was no appropriate response to how we design today at this scale. There's lots of design applications that are happening in the saturated, wet, coastal, littoral regions, dealing with these climate uncertainties. But as we look through in landscape design, examples of arid practices, it is most commonly reduced to a plant palette or native species, and talks about how we can just design on this very small local scale and not really interfacing and impacting cities and systems and things as that. So I've been trying to figure out, like, well, why, where do I start here? Like, what is the starting point? What is the reason why deserts or arid regions are not, they're scary, right? Like, what are they not at the same as these other regions? There's lots of people that live there. But I think one theory is, Diana Davis here in the arid lands was talking about, that deserts are associated with like torment and sin, and and this is reinforced dramatically during the periods of colonialism as we, as people started to capitalize on these landscapes, and they were different, right? So therefore they needed to be managed differently, and they were not green, so we need to make them green, right? So these areas that experienced not only environmental transformations, but again, these are areas where their margins are continually combated as anthropogenic forces attempt to redefine their natural state, right? And they're constantly associated with being barren, deforested. How could they be deforested if they're, not forested in the first place, right? These are words that I've come across when we talk about deserts, wastelands, voids, etc., that have little value, and therefore these are places, right, that need to be transformed into this saturated ideal. And this, these are some ads that are in from Las Vegas, the Southern Nevada Water Authority. That water, what does it bring to the desert? And I just from a graphic standpoint, right, that it's this contrast of green and oasis and lush and life, right, that obviously does not, by their picture, exist there in the beginning, right? And so that to have a future in the desert, you must adopt these types of practices. And right, this management or lack of understanding has resulted in these multi-million-dollar campaigns to fight the expansion of deserts, right? Such as the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, the Great Green Wall Initiative in the Sahel, and also the Great Green Wall Project in China, where they're looking at these as being symbols of hope of our urbanization practices, right? And the one in the Sahel is advertised as the largest living structure on the planet, an 8,000 kilometer natural wonder in an African dream, right? And so these are these propaganda mechanisms that are being promoted to change and shift and transform deserts into environments that they are not. And obviously, there's lots of mechanics attached to transforming a desert, and they're not as successful as they sound. So how I started to begin with this topic is starting to interface with scales of intervention, right? To look at the arid through this dynamic zooming from like the local to the global, right? From the experienced to the concealed, and to the experienced to the conceived. So what is needed is a remapping, right? Where the static taxonomies are dissolved so that dynamic truths can really emerge to start to describe the process of the arid. In landscape architecture, James Corner, he talks about this creative practice and mapping in our profession, that it's, that through this finding and founding that we can start to really uncover these uncovered realities, right, that are hidden. So delineating the arid lands of the world is also a highly contested process, as climatic and human-induced forces are continually shifting these fragile boundaries and making them absolute delineation virtually impossible. However, there are several methods in order to understand it, and at least a 2D representation, right, that have informed our contemporary understanding and classification of how to at least map them. One of them here is the aridity index, which is the amount of precipitation divided by its potential, evotranspiration, I always say that word wrong. And they're also delineated between hyper-arid, arid, and semi-arid landscapes. The next one that I was looking at was the Köppen climate classification, which is based on seasonal precipitation and temperature patterns. First published in 1884, it is still widely accepted today as to distinguish different climatic types. Arid regions are within Group B, which is dry, and then further classified W as one of them, which in German, when it was originated, is Wüste, which means wasteland, right? So dry wasteland that's hot. And another way that we start to talk about deserts is actually through their ecoregions, right, which is delineated through distinct assemblages of natural communities and species. And through the desert ecoregions in xeric shrublands, we have 95 distinct regions. As such, approximately between 14 and 29% of our world within these designation falls within these arid classifications. This is a significant percentage and a significant impact on our global narrative of a landscape, and it merits critical attention, especially as our climates are in crisis. So part of my thinking is beyond looking at just urbanization practices, looking at the city as this material fluid energy, right? That the city is not the physical political extent, right? It extends into the territory. Then we must look at everything that scales that acknowledge flows of water, atmospheric conditions, soils, vegetation, etc., to start to interface with these problems. Through a blending of mapping methods from the empirical to the experiential, I was looking at how these landscapes start to emerge and how do we classify them. Here, this is from the world land cover data set. I should have marked that, it's over here somewhere. But this is what is classified as barren, actually, landscapes, right? That these are the empty spaces throughout the arid. And it's interesting when you start to overlay different types of information to actually start to see what future narratives emerge, right? Also, 30% of our world's agriculturally productive lands are within the arid designations. 30%, that's not a small number. That's a lot of agriculture that is at stake, especially as we're looking at depleting water sources and shifting boundaries. And the livelihoods that depend on these lands, not only as outputs, but the management for survival in terms of economic standpoints, is critical in that instance. Right, and we start to look at urbanization, right, that there's in 2007, 38% of the world's then 6.5 billion residents actually resided in the global drylands. And based on the United Nations population prospects, these are only to increase, where we'll put immense strain on water availability, energy demands, food supplies, and such. Also, having these critical biodiversity hotspots that are also within the arid landscape, where the vulnerabilities obviously just compound with these other issues. Also, thinking about the top water-stressed countries in the world, there's 17 of them, and they're all located or have have arid landscapes as part of their makeup. And in 2030, it's projected to affect over 470 million people in these large cities of these countries. and also where watersheds are depleting and the ratio between our consumptive practices, right, of domestic, industrial, irrigation, livestock consumption. These watersheds are depleting at a rapid rate. And another way to start to critically think about and map how these places actually impact, right? And again, drought, just another way to look at it. And I think about these things, being in Las Vegas, where like many other arid cities, is completely, or it's really isolated from food, for example, right? And if anything were to happen in these drought-stricken landscapes, how do we urbanize food, or how do we look at this food source in these areas, and what is that change, right? And what is in jeopardy, and how do we survive in that context? Especially as, which we don't commonly think about because we don't hear it in media, that the American Southwest is actually going to feel the effects of climate change before coastal regions will actually see those significant impacts. So in considering these techniques to remap the arid world, there are several insights that cannot be overlooked and viewed naively. The strategic process of acquiring data while maintaining levels of cohesion and standardization will indefinitely pose a series of challenges, right? For example, aerial imagery resolution, the translation of urban histories, availability of data, which I had a lot of problems finding, and obviously the urgency and timeliness of these matters presents challenges and questions. So to bring this future into focus, our preconditions and motivations for design must be reconsidered and recontextualized. The open, dynamic, connected landscape becomes the method to reinvent our cities and their relationships to the territory. By remapping and extracting new narratives to describe the areas of the world that are mismanaged and ignored, we can disrupt the status quo, transform the discussion, and give attention to all landscapes. These processes will equip future urbanists with strategies to design through gradients, right, between the coast and through the arid, between the wet and the dry. Therefore, looking at landscape for solutions structured around this new inclusive territorial resiliency. Thank you.